Okay, so last lecture we took the amendment of the basic legislation, which is the Constitution, as we agreed on, the highest grade of legislation and the most important one. Today we are going to take the enactment of ordinary legislation and the subsidiary legislation, which are the two grades following the Constitution. Ordinary legislation is more important than subsidiary legislation, which is higher than it in the hierarchy of legislations. First, let's start with the enactment of subsidiary legislation before the ordinary legislation. Subsidiary legislations, as I told you before, are the least important in the hierarchy of the pyramid. These are the ways of implementation, the tiny details of application of the ordinary laws. So in principle, all acts of legislation are the exclusive jurisdiction of the legislative authority. As we agreed on last tutorial, the legislative authority is mainly in charge of enacting legislations. However, exceptionally, regulating legislation requires full knowledge of all the different circumstances where it is to be implemented and their minutest details. So this is why we had here a major exception to the rule that the legislative authority enacts the whole legislation. In this case, the subsidiary legislation, unlike the other legislation, it's not going to be enacted by the House of Representatives because the nature of these executive regulations differ than the other legislation, which require another authority to be enacted by, and we are going to see the reasons now. Therefore, only the executive authority is aware of the implementing details, as it's impossible for the legislative authority to anticipate such circumstances in advance and to include them in the legislation itself. So the House of Representatives, in order to be able to handle and to update and to create new laws, must have enough time to create and to discuss these laws. So in order not to cause delay for the House of Representatives to be able to be updated with the change of the community and consequently to create new laws, in order to save time on the House of Representatives, such delegation was made from the House of Representatives to the executive authority, the government, that will instead be in charge of the creation of these executive regulations. So the legislative authority delegates the executive authority to enact subsidiary legislations to save time on the House of Representatives, and also the executive regulations, as I told you before in the last tutorial, is in charge, or one of its functions is to make sure to enforce and to implement the legislations. So if I'm going to be able to implement legislations, this means that I can more understand and I will have more knowledge. How am I going to enforce these legislation through the subsidiary legislations and the decrees and executive regulations? And this is why such delegation was made. So if any of these executive regulations or decrees under subsidiary legislations were enacted by the government and one of them didn't match the ordinary law or the constitution, then it's going to be immediately cancelled and rejected by the council state. The subsidiary legislations are always bound by the relevant principal legislations enacted by the legislative authority. Moving on to the enactment of ordinary legislation or the ordinary laws. As we agreed before, this is the second grade coming after the Constitution, so this is somehow less important than the Constitution. So here, if we're going to talk about the steps and conditions required to enact the ordinary legislation, we need to know that for sure these conditions will be more flexible than the one required for the Constitution. So let's start with the first step of the enactment of an ordinary legislation, assuming that we want to enact a new legislation stating that anyone who is going to throw trash in the street will pay an immediate fine worth 500 Egyptian pounds. Who will be entitled to submit such proposal? So step number one, submission of proposal. Here we have three entities that will have the right and will be allowed to submit such proposal. Number one will be the president of the state and the government, any member of the government, any ministers, or 1/10 of members of the parliament. So if any of these three suggested a proposal or submitted a proposal, this proposal will go directly to the competent and specialized committee related to the object or the nature of the new law itself. So if we have this simple example of throwing trash in the street, let's assume that the competent and specialized committee that will discuss this potential law might be the environmental competent committee or health competent committee. So what's the work of this competent and specialized committee? It's going to discuss this potential law. What are the advantages and disadvantages of the law? And then it's going to submit a report that will be sent to the House of Representatives members to tell them their opinion, whether to recommend them to approve on this potential law or to disapprove. But in any way, whether they recommend to approve or to disapprove, their opinion is only to advise the House of Representatives Parliament member. So this means that the House of Representatives member, they are not going to be bound by the recommendation or the non-recommendation given by the competent specialized committee. They have the right to take it into consideration or to simply ignore it. This is the case number one. Case number two, we have this proposal that came from less than 1/10 of Parliament's or House of Representatives members. In this case, we cannot transmit directly this proposal to the competent and specialized committee because we're not sure even that its content is something that is logic and is worthy discussion. This is why first we can say that it must pass by a certain filter, and this filter is called Proposal and Complaint Committee. What's the specific work of this Proposal and Complaint Committee? This Proposal and Complaint Committee is going to check whether the proposal that was sent from less than 1/10 of Parliament's member or House of Representatives Parliament member, is this potential idea or potential law, is it worthy discussion or not? So we have two cases. If this is a good proposal, then it will be worthy discussion. Then this proposal will be sent to the competent and specialized committee. But if this Proposal and Complaint Committee found out that it's not a good proposal, then it will be rejected. Assuming that the law was passed by the competent and specialized committee, we moved on to a Proposal and Complaint Committee, and then the competent and specialized committee. What would be step number two? Step number two will be the approval of the new ordinary law or the approval of the law. How can we approve on the draft of the law? First of all, we need to make sure that a minimum number of House of Representatives members are attending the session in order to be able to discuss the approval of such ordinary law. So number one, the quorum of attendance for validity of sessions is 50% of the members. So in order to be able to start the process of approval of the draft, we must be at least half of the House of Representatives members attending in session. If we have this condition that is satisfied, we are going to move to the quorum of voting. How can we actually pass and approve on a certain ordinary law? The quorum of voting is absolute majority of the present members, provided that they are not less than 1/3 of the whole parliament's member. So in order to make sure that this is a good law, 50% plus one of the parliament's member who attended based on the quorum of attendance, they must approve on this law. And also there's a second cumulative condition that this number, by all means, they cannot be less than 1/3 of the whole parliament's member. If we reached these two cumulative conditions, then we are going to pass to the last step of the enactment of ordinary legislation, which is the non-veto of the president or the non-objection of the president. So this new law is going to be sent to the president of the state, and the president of the state, we have two scenarios. First scenario, that the president of the state is going to sign the law and he has nothing to say about this law, and later on we are going to know about the implementation of the law, whether it's promulgation and proclamation. This is the simple scenario, while the complex scenario is that the president is going to veto or to object against this law. Can we consider such veto as final? The answer is no. In principle, the president is not the one who enacts the legislation, so consequently, his veto cannot be final. So what are we going to do? Within 30 days, when the law is going to be sent to the president, if he is going to object to this law, if he is not satisfied by this law, he is going to send this law again for a second time to the House of Representatives, who are going to vote for the second time on this legislation. But logically speaking, they cannot approve on this law with the same quorums they approved before in the first voting. As a consequence, this time the House of Representatives, they must approve on this ordinary law by 2/3 super majority. So again, we have two cases. The law was sent again to the parliament. The parliament couldn't reach the approval of 2/3 of House of Representatives. Then this means that the law will be rejected and cancelled. So this law won't exist. Case number two, that the House of Representatives, they reach the approval by the 2/3 supermajority, then in this case, the 2/3 of House of Representatives, they are going to override the veto that was given by the president of the state. Implementation of legislation and its entry into force. The task of the legislative authority is completed by the approval of the president of the draft project or draft proposition, or by his non-veto of it within the defined time limit. But the new law cannot enter into force except when the people to whom it would be applied learn of it. Thus, it's necessary for the implementation of a law to have the executive authority publish it in the official gazette. So we basically need to know that the implementation of a new legislation includes two parts. First of all, it's the promulgation of legislation and the proclamation of legislation. The first phase of the implementation of legislation is called the promulgation of legislation. Who is going to promulgate the legislation? The president, in his capacity as head of the executive authority, shall promulgate the legislation, and the purpose of such enactment being Number one, for the president to declare that the competent authority has passed a new legislation. So the signature of the president on this legislation means that the president says implicitly that there's a new law that has been enacted by the House of Representatives who respected the steps of enactment of the law that we took earlier, the proposal, the approval, and then the non-veto of the president. The second purpose of such promulgation is that the president is going to order his civil servants of the executive authority to sanction it as one of the enforceable laws of the state. So this means that the president is going to give a direct order for the government and he's going to sort of tell them, heads up, this is a new law that has been enforced and has been enacted, and then government, you must be aware of this new law and to start making sure that it's going to be applied, and if it's not going to be respected, there should be a certain sanction. The third purpose of such promulgation is for the president to order the publication of this legislation in the official gazette, thus determining the date for its entry into force. So this is a very important purpose of the promulgation, as it's a transition between the promulgation of legislation and the proclamation of legislation. How can people actually know that there's a new law that has been enacted? This law is going to be published in the official gazette, that is a specific newspaper made for the new laws, and it has also access online. And after being published, this law after a certain time is going to be binding and it's going to enter into force, and anyone who is not going to respect it is going to be penalized. And here comes the second phase of the implementation of legislation. The Proclamation of Legislation, which is the second phase of the implementation of legislation, that comes right after the promulgation of legislation. Why do we need to proclaim a legislation? A new legislation enters into force upon its promulgation, but it's unfair to apply it to the public without their knowing of it. Assuming that we are going to proceed with the law that we took before for the enactment of ordinary law, that anyone who is going to throw rubbish or dirt in the street will be subject to a fine worth £500. Assuming that the law was published 2 days ago. If I was walking in the street and I was eating a banana and I throw the banana in the street and the policeman stopped me and he told me, you are going to pay a fine worth £500. I told him why. He told me because there's a law that was enforced 2 days ago and became binding and states that if you are going to throw anything in the street, then you will pay a fine worth £500. Does this scenario seem to be fair for you? The fact that, can I be 100% sure that during these 2 days after its publication, all people or the majority of the people, they actually knew about this law? The answer must be no. This is unfair. We cannot assume that during this period all people have known this law. So how to answer or how to give a solution for this problem? Justice generally requires that the enforcement of this new legislation should be linked to knowledge of it. So how can we assume that people already knew the law existed? This is what we are going to figure out now. So here comes the part of the ignorance of the law is not an excuse. As I told you before, under the proclamation of the legislation, we need to make sure that people already knew that a certain law existed in order to be penalized if they do not respect it. Article 255 of the Constitution provides that laws should be published in the official Gazette within 15 days from their promulgation and shall enter into force 1 month from the day following their publication unless another date is provided for. So this means that option number one, okay, the general rule that if law itself doesn't provide when it's going to be binding, then based on the Constitution, the law will become binding after its publication 1 month. Or option number two, that the law itself is going to state when it becomes binding. For example, it can state that it will be binding after 2 weeks, then the law will become binding after 2 weeks. After that period, no excuse of ignorance of the law shall be acceptable from anyone. So whenever the 1 month is going to lapse or the period stated in the law will be applied on everyone. Not a person can state that he didn't know that this law existed. The law becomes binding once and for all. So we are not going to examine the personal circumstances of every person who will abide by the law. So for instance, if I was in a coma in a hospital and a law became binding and the 1 month has lapsed, and I just got out of the hospital the following day and I was walking in the street eating my banana and I threw the banana in the street. The policeman stopped me and he told me you'll pay a fine of 500 pounds. I told him why. He explained me that this is a new law. I told him, right, there's a proof that I was in a coma in the hospital and I didn't know that this law existed. Can this police officer exempt me from paying the fine? The answer is absolutely no, because ignorance of the law is not an excuse. Once we have this period that has lapsed, the law will become binding for everyone. However, the application of this principle presupposes that the official gazette reaches all people. So this means that we must be sure that there's nothing that prevented the official gazette from reaching the people. Okay. The scope of application of ignorance of the law is not an excuse. This has two parts. The first one, as regards to the legal type of rules, this principle is applied to all legal rules, whether they are legislations or customs. So this means that if I am before the judge in a certain lawsuit and the judge is going to apply a certain legislation or a certain custom on me, I cannot tell him that I ignore the existence of this custom or this legislation. He's going to respond and tell me ignorance of the law is not an excuse. This is number one. Number two, as regards to the type of the legal rule itself, we have two types of legal rules. We have the mandatory rules and the explanatory or supplementary rules. The mandatory rules are binding rules taken as they are. So the people cannot change it, and later on they can say that they didn't know that they were mandatory rules. While the explanatory or supplementary rules, these are rules that can be amended or modified by the parties in the contract. But once modified or adjusted, then they will become binding as they are. So the parties in the contract, they cannot say that they didn't knew that they were supplementary or they were mandatory. The only exception and exemption to the principle stated before, ignorance of the law is not an excuse, the undisputed exception, is called the force majeure. So what's the meaning of this new terminology, force majeure? It's generally agreed that ignorance of the law may be accepted as an excuse in all cases where it's proved that it was impossible for the public to know of the law through the designated means determined by the law, namely through the official gazette. So basically, this state of force majeure means that people somehow won't be able to get access to the official gazette, and consequently, they won't be able to know the existence of a certain law. So, how can we at the end penalize them if they didn't actually know? So, what's the meaning of this force majeure? This is a state or an event that is unpredictable. We cannot know that it's coming. It's irresistible. We cannot resist against this state, okay? And it's going to prevent us from having access to the official gazette. These impossible circumstances are the force majeure that make the arrival of this gazette to certain parts of the state impossible. What can be the examples of such state? We have the occupation of parts of the state by the enemy, or the occurrence of an earthquake, or the occurrence of a disaster, such as a flood or other such circumstances that render knowledge of the law by the designated means impossible.